Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Now, Russia has formally withdrawn from a UN brokered deal to export Ukrainian grain across the Black Sea, potentially imperiling tens of millions of tons of food exports around the world. President Vladimir Putin said the agreement had essentially stopped and Russia would no longer cooperate with the deal. Joining us now to discuss this is the chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber, Wandile Shlobo. Wandile, good evening and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Good evening, Fahraaz. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Wandile. When we look at it, of course, I mean, the Black Sea grain is such an important part of food export across the world, not just, of course, in Europe. How does this put food security in terms of the rest of the globe, especially here in Africa, where there's much reliance on grain from that part of the world?
Absolutely, Fahraaz. That area of the world is very important when we're thinking about global grain supplies. And of course, I think the key thing to really see its benefit is if we look back from the period after the war had started around about February. In March, we saw global grain prices reaching record levels. And that then led to the United Nations, Turkey, and the other world leaders coming together and saying, look, how can we ensure that the flow of the product, which was in Ukraine at the time, just over 30 million tons of grain, can flow to the world market. And that led to this grain deal being reached somewhere around about July last year, and really allowing the exports of grain out of Ukraine without bombs and all of the disruption that was caused by Russia. And if you were to look at it since then it started, in terms of prices, it's been very constructive in a sense that we saw global grain prices declining. If you check between June this year and you compare to June last year, around about 20%, and part of it was because of that grain deal. Now, to your point, some of the people in Africa or elsewhere may not have benefited directly from importing or consuming Ukrainian grains, but that being available in the world market, it signals the decline. Everybody benefit when the prices are going down, which is why commodity doesn't reach all of the African countries.
Wandile, Russia said that they would come back to the table if certain demands are met from their side. But from now up until then, what should consumers, and I'm talking specifically here in South Africa because we obviously need to look in our own doorstep, what should consumers be looking at in terms of any food that is, of course, manufactured using grain, up until they can have all of these parties back onto a table and the Black Sea grain can, of course, be exported again?
I think in a South African context, Fahraaz, we are sitting reasonably well as South Africa, in a sense that if you look at our grain supplies, we have had one of the excellent agricultural seasons. We have the second largest summer grains harvest on record, if you think about maize and soybeans, and that ensures that we do have the supplies. But of course, what comes from the Black Sea is primarily wheat, and South Africa usually imports about 1.5 million tons of wheat a year. And if you think about that already imported roughly about 1 million tons of wheat is already in South Africa. So we do have that access to the supplies. And our view at the Agricultural Business Chamber has always been that for much of the second half of this year, we could see South Africa's consumer food price inflation softening. And I think, whereas you will look at the data, for example, that came out earlier today from Stats SA signaling that inflation is starting to slow. And we think that will continue for much of the second half of this year, even with this uncertainty that is in this grain deal, because there's usually a lag of between about 3 to 5 months between the changes in prices at farm level, as well as what we get to see the changes at a retail level. And we think that the decline in prices that has happened over the past few months is sufficient to keep the inflation cooling for much of the second half of the year. But of course, the uncertainty that exists now will be important or significant for a consumer if it remains for longer. Our very hope is that Russia could get back to the table and talk with the world leaders, and we can establish some new form of framework to ensure that there continues to be trade in the grains within the Black Sea region, because that's important for stabilizing the food supplies.
Wandile, before I let you go, you mentioned, of course, the consumer inflation, a little bit of a relief for South African consumers. We wait to see what will happen with the Reserve Bank's decision tomorrow in terms of interest rate hikes or not. But the South African, in terms of their own production of wheat, well, actually of just grain itself, are we in okay position? I mean, if we're talking obviously right now to South Africans and those who are watching, should we be worried, or is there a slight sense of concern with the stopping of the Black Sea grain?
I think our message to South Africans at this point is that in terms of the food supplies as a country, we are intact. So the consumer should not worry that they may run out of products or anything. South Africa is intact on that. We are good. But of course, what we continue to monitor is how long this uncertainty about the grain deal, as well as its effects on global prices. If, of course, there's no decision reached and there's uncertainty for longer, over the period, we may see the impact of this through the domestic grain prices, and over time, of course, that's something that we will monitor. But with all of the evidence that we have now, we are good on supplies, and we think that the prices will continue moderating, which is positive for the South African consumer. So what somebody sitting at home around this thing is really, really about worth monitoring and seeing what will come over the coming weeks, but there's no need for panic.
Wandile, would like to say thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me on.
That's Wandile Shlobo. He is the chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber, talking to us about the Black Sea grain and, of course, it being stopped by Russia. For now, South Africa can breathe a slight sigh of relief because we have the ability at home to produce grain and, of course, so much of the starch that many people consume. Of course, what happens going forward if all the parties are not coming to the table to find a solution for the exports of that from Ukraine? After the break, I'll have your latest in news. Do stay tuned.